Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, I want to welcome everyone to this webinar today. I want people to know that the webinar is being recorded. We have over 400 people registered, so this will be an exciting event and people are looking forward to it. I want to acknowledge that we are living and working on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, also known as the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We are situated on the Haliment Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. We are Canadian Voices for Palestinian Rights. We are a nonpartisan community group based in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. We aim to create awareness of the effects of the Israeli military occupation on the Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the lack of equality for Palestinians living in Israel, and the enduring statelessness of Palestinian refugees in exile. We support justice and equality for all within the frameworks of human rights, international humanitarian law, and UN resolutions. Through its advocacy and educational activities, the group denounces all barriers and oppression created by racism, discrimination, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and colonialism. During the webinar today, please feel free to submit any questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. I will track them and they'll be asked at the end of the presentation. I'd like now to take a moment to introduce board members. I'm Robert Fantina and I'm a member of the board. I'll now go Mesa.
I am Mesa Al-Mustafa.
Mamoun.
I'm Mamoun Yanis.
Kathy.
I'm Kathy Bergen.
And Lillian.
Oh, Lillian is mute. Lillian, you're mute.
I'm Lillian Matar-Peti.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, Peter Lawson, the chair of OFIP, who is scheduled to be with us today, is unable to join us. Today's webinar commemorates Nexa Day, which happened on June 5th, 1967, when Israel began occupying the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, Sinai, and the Golan Heights. We are privileged to have Professor Jeff Halper to address Nexa Day with us. I'll turn the time over to Kathy Bergen now to introduce him. Kathy?
Okay, thank you, Bob. Many of you, in fact, probably most of you on this webinar already know Jeff, either have met him in Jerusalem or you were on our webinar several months ago where he and Awad talked about their project, the One State campaign. But I will introduce him anyway for those of you who have not met him before and don't really know him. Jeff Halper is an Israeli anthropologist. He's a co-founder of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions in Jerusalem and a founding member of the One Democratic State campaign. Jeff served as the head of the Friends World's College, an international college program, and has taught at universities in Israel and around the world. In addition to his many academic and political writings, he is the author of An Israeli in Palestine, on his work against the occupation, Obstacles to Peace, and War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification. That was his latest book before this one that we're discussing today came out, which is shortlisted for Palestine Book Award, which was shortlisted, sorry. His latest book is Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for a One Democratic State. Jeff participated in the first attempt of the Free Gaza movement to break the Israeli siege by sailing into Gaza. I remember when he was on that boat and was arrested and in prison for, I don't know how long, but I know it was not a very pleasant experience. I remember that. He was nominated by the American Friends Service Committee in 2006 for the Nobel Peace Prize, together with a Palestinian intellectual and activist, Ghassan Andoni, who many of us also know. So welcome, Jeff. Welcome to the webinar and welcome to Canada again.
Okay. Thanks for having me again, all of you. I wish it could be in person. I'm starting to get cabin fever here in Jerusalem. But it's good to be with you all on this 54th anniversary of the Naksa, of the 1967 war and the occupation. So I don't know if that's an auspicious occasion for us to meet, but it's certainly a time to reflect, for all of us to reflect politically and to figure out, this is really was always been my agenda, how do we get out of all of this? So should I start a little bit and talk about the book and the context of it?
Please.
I've been involved for many, many decades, actually, on this issue. And since 1997, I've been the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. That's an Israeli activist group that obviously focuses on the issue of house demolitions. But we began to understand that, in fact, house demolitions weren't only an activist issue, one issue out of many, but was really the essence of the conflict. Because when you deny someone a home and a homeland, the words are connected, the message really is get out. You have no place in this country. And house demolitions is one of the essential elements of the whole ethnic cleansing, the displacement of the Palestinian people by Zionism, not only from 1967, from 1948. And we estimate in ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, that Israel's demolished somewhere around 140 to 150,000 Palestinian homes. And not only homes, but also essential structures, farm structures, fences, reservoirs, schools, mosques, community centers, urban neighborhoods. So we're really talking about not just about a policy of demolishing a particular home that we often focus on, but really a massive, a complete cleansing of the. Part of settler colonialism, which is the basis of Zionism, this is what I write my book about, is to erase the native presence. Not only eliminate the people, sometimes physically, or at least partly physically, not only to displace them, but to erase them, to eliminate their very presence, because part of the idea of settler colonialism, and you living in a settler colonial country in Canada, and we appropriately opened by acknowledging the indigenous rights to the land that you're on. Settler colonialism, and what's interesting, so my book really deals with settler colonialism as the framework that we have to deal with, not a conflict, but settler colonialism. And people don't really yet quite understand what that means. It's a very academic term. It's quite actually popular in the academic circles. There's even journals about settler colonialism, but it hasn't really, it's only now beginning to enter into the public discourse. But people have to be aware of what it means. And it really means, colonialism was when Britain would conquer India. A country would conquer another country in order to exploit it for its resources, its cheap labor, or whatever. In settler colonialism, the idea is that the settlers are coming to take over the country. They develop a whole narrative, a whole story, and we all know the Zionist story, based on the Bible and the return and all of this stuff. All settlers make up a story about why the land really belongs to them and not to the indigenous population, why they're entitled to it. And with Zionism, there was the idea not only of entitlement, but exclusive entitlement. The idea was that this was a land, Palestine was a land without a people. So that it wasn't a conflict, because in a conflict, you have two sides. And the way we've been approaching this all these years is wrong, because a conflict resolution, mechanism says you get the sides together, they're fighting about something, you negotiate it, they compromise, and you come up with some kind of a deal. But settler colonialism is unilateral. In other words, there is no other side. When Zionism came to this country at the beginning of the 20th century, it came so with the intention, and this is the word it's used for years, it came with the intention of Judaizing the country, of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country, transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. And the Zionists were very upfront about it. They didn't hide it, because in those days, colonialism didn't have the negative implications that it has in our time. So they were very upfront about it. They called it colonization, and they were very clear about the fact that they wanted to erase the Palestinian presence. I mean, Jabotinsky came up with the idea of the Iron Wall, that was a part of that. And in general, that was the idea. And only in 1948, of course, did the Zionist movement, as it became the state of Israel, have the power politically and militarily and economically to carry out its physically its program of ethnic cleansing, of Judaization, of displacement, and of eliminating the natives, erasing as much as possible the Palestinian presence. So not only did Israel systematically demolish more than 500 entire Palestinian villages and towns and urban areas, but it also changed the names of all the places, so that even if you see here and there some remnants, an old building or some cactus or something, if you have a good eye, you can see the ruins of the Palestinian society still a little bit through the trees of the woods that they planted on top of it. The names have been changed, so no one really can get an idea of where places are. And that's in a sense why the house demolition issue that I started talking about, we discovered was so important, because we had approached it originally just as activists. Some activists are dealing with the wall, some are dealing with settlements, some are dealing with water issues, some are dealing with Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan. We decided to take house demolitions. But only as we were getting involved did we appreciate the significance of the house demolition issue, how it related to these wider, and how you go back, and it basically was an essential component of the settler colonial project of Israel. So that ICAD, the organization that I've run all these years, was never only an activist group. It was always political. We always said, you could end house demolitions tomorrow, which I hope we will, but that still wouldn't end occupation. And actually occupation, we talk all the time about ending the occupation. That's become the mantra of the pro-Palestinian cause, in a sense, end the occupation. But actually what settler colonialism shows you, once you begin to understand that, is it's not only the occupation. The occupied territories are 22% of Palestine. What about the other 78%? What about the millions of Palestinians who live inside the 48 borders? You see, so that what the settler colonial approach does, and this is what the house demolition issue helped us to do, because house demolitions aren't only done in the West Bank. Until today, demolitions are being done, and sometimes at a faster rate, inside Israel, against Palestinian citizens of Israel, than they are in the occupied territory. So that this 48 continues, the Nakba continues, not only the Naksa of 67. And so the whole idea of settler colonialism isn't only crucial for understanding the logic and the dynamics of what's happening today, but it really makes us look at the entire country and not only the occupied territory. So ICAD was always a political organization. We always said, well, house demolitions it's not only the problem of the house itself, there's a lot of questions around it. Why is Israel demolishing this house? Because house demolitions has nothing to do with security, unlike how Israel always casts it. In 90% of the cases, security has nothing to do with the demolition. It's mainly done to take the land or to prevent Palestinians from building where Israel doesn't want them to build, so it can concentrate them all in about 10 or 12% of the country in tiny enclaves and take their land. That's the whole idea of settler colonialism. The whole purpose of Zionism was to take the whole country not 78% of it. So this whole idea that somehow we're going to negotiate a two-state solution and a colonial movement is going to allow a Palestinian state of the indigenous people to arise within its own boundaries, that it claims exclusively for it, that's impossible. It was never in the cards. The two-state solution isn't dead. It was never born. And it's partly wasn't born because until today, Israel has never acknowledged the existence, let alone the national rights of the Palestinian people. And it can't, because if you understand settler colonialism, you understand the entitlement that comes with it. In other words, the whole rationale, the whole justification, the whole moral foundation, as Zionists would say, of coming in and taking over this country, making it a Jewish country, is that it belongs to us. It's our country exclusively. Now, the minute you acknowledge that there's another people here, the minute you acknowledge a Palestinian people, you undercut your own entitlement, your own claims. So structurally, logically, politically, Israel cannot allow itself to recognize the very existence of the Palestinian people. Now, in Canada, you can recognize the existence of the first Americans, as you call them, the Native Americans, because they're today such small groups and so powerless and marginal that it doesn't threaten the settler colonial state that you have. Here, it's a different situation, of course, because here the Palestinians today are actually the majority population in this country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And if refugees come back, there'll be a larger majority. And there are people that have not given up their national claims to a state. So in many ways, Israel not acknowledging them isn't only because we want to erase them, which is the basic logic of it all, but it's also because if we do allow a sliver of acknowledgement and recognition, that opens this Pandora's box to national claims over the country that essentially challenge the Zionist claim and the Israeli claim to sovereignty here. And that can't be. So I'm kind of laying this out. This is the context that we're working in. So, and I'm gonna, let me end on this and then we can go to discussion and questions. So, if we're a political organization, ICAD, then always the question has been, how do we get out of this? We don't want to I refuse to be an activist that spends all the time protesting and even resisting. I mean, those things are very important, and advocating and publicizing what's happening and educating the public and everything that ICAD has always done. And I've been to Canada many times, as you all know, in your community. But we have to be a part of a political movement. There has to be a political resolution to this whole thing. Now, for many years, of course, the two-state solution was the solution that was accepted. Once the PLO adopted the two-state solution in 1988, we were kind of stuck with it. We knew it wasn't going to work, but that was the PLO, that was the national leadership's decision, for better or for worse, and we went with that. But it's been obvious, as the PLO itself has been dismantled by Israel through the Palestinian Authority, so it doesn't function anymore, and the PAA has become a collaborationist regime. We've seen now, at least over the last 20 years, that the two-state solution again, never was. So for the last 20 years, I would say, we've been in a vacuum politically, without an alternative. And the alternative, the political solution to this, or the political program, has to be formulated by Palestinians. They're the only ones that can lead a liberation movement. And the only way out of this is through decolonization. Decolonization is the only way, and this is what my book gets into in detail, it's the only way you end a settler colonial regime. Unless you decolonize, it stays that regime forever. Now in Canada, you'll always have a settler colonial regime because the first Americans aren't strong enough to actually decolonize. So they're trying to carve out some kind of sovereign space within the settler state. But here, the Palestinians haven't given up the idea of their sovereignty, of a national expression, they haven't acquiesced to the settler state, and partly because the settler state has to be much more violent and oppressive than the Canadian state. The Canadian state had its moments, we know, and all settler states are violent, but at some point it managed to stabilize things. Israel has never reached that, as we saw with Gaza. The 11 days of Gaza, Israel didn't make Gaza surrender. So the point I'm trying to get to is that the only way out of this is decolonization, which means dismantling the colonial structures of domination and control. And we have to have a good idea of what are those structures that Israeli settler colonialism is based on, dismantle them, and then to reassemble a new country, an inclusive country, based on the idea that everyone living here is here, will be a citizen. And of course, it has to be the right of return of refugees. And this is now our people. And on that basis, then, to build a new state, I mean, I'm not crazy about states, but that's the system that the international system is forcing us to live within, a new polity based on individual rights. In other words, one person, one vote, one citizenship, one legal system, a constitutional democracy that then gives rise to a shared civil society. And that civil society that comes into being originally in the beginning, that we're all equal citizens based on citizenship, hopefully over time, as we live together and work together and study together and simply participate in a common country, will eventually give rise to what's called a new political community, a new us. It doesn't mean that we're not Palestinians anymore, or we're not Israelis anymore, or we're not religious, or we're not this or that. It means that there's a new us that kind of pulls us together in general as a political community. Just like, in Canada, you have the idea of being Canadians with all the different multi-ethnic and religious and even national, with the first Americans, identities involved with that. So our idea is you have a right to keep your collective identity, whatever it is. You can remain Palestinian and you can be Zionist if you want to, as long as you're living and participating within the framework of a democratic society. And I think that, so we have a 10-point program that we've developed. Again, this is a Palestinian-led initiative, which is important. You can see our manifesto on our website, which is onestatecampaign.org, a 10-point program. But the one question that remains then is this doable? Is this just utopian? I mean, it's a nice idea, but come on. And I think it is doable. And I want to take 30 seconds and tell you why, because I know
my son's waiting.
Okay. That is this, that one of the reasons why people think it's utopian is Israel would never allow it, which is true. We have to understand that settlers are not going to decolonize their own colony. Why would they? They're enjoying it. They're on top. They're ruling. They've gotten all the resources. Why would they want to dismantle that? They won't. And we understood that from South Africa, and we understood that from other settler regimes. In Kenya and Angola and Mozambique, and you have your tensions in Canada as well, the U.S., Australia. So that what we have to do is come into this struggle realizing that the Israeli Jews are not going to be persuaded. They're not on our side. We have to find a way, and this is what the ANC did in South Africa, to bypass the Israeli public, to bypass the Israeli government, and to go directly to the only powerful ally the Palestinian people have, which is you. The international civil society, grassroots, the global community of people. And we see now after the attacks on Gaza, I think there's been a sea change. And I know in Canada as well, I've been reading, in terms of support and understanding of the Palestinian cause. So that the international community, not the governments yet, but the people, are mobilized. They are organized to a large degree. I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of organizations. I travel all over the world. I can go to the Faroe Islands, places I've never heard of, and there are Palestinian solidarity committees. So that infrastructure exists. The mobilization is there. The problem is, going back to what we talked about, is that there is no political plan. There's no program. There's no end game. And you can't mobilize people and then not give them something to advocate for. So if you go to your government and say, Palestine, and they say, okay, what do you want? And you say some slogan like end the occupation, that's not gonna, they'll throw you out the door. So that's our weakness, that there is no yet Palestinian-led political program that we can insert to give a focus and direction to the international, to you guys, so you can then begin to change your government's policies. And in the end, we can make, with that kind of a focus and mobilization, I really do believe we can isolate Israel and make its apartheid system collapse, just like we did in South Africa. But there has to be a political endgame. With South Africa, when we did BDS, it was always an endgame. It was one person, one vote. And whenever Mandela would go, whenever de Klerk would go to Mandela and offer power sharing or this or that, no, we always knew one person, one vote was the end game. And that's what we're lacking here in Palestine. So our organization, the one I've joined now, the One Democratic State Campaign, the Palestinian-led One Democratic State Campaign, is trying very hard to formulate, articulate, and insert a political endgame into our political work. It's very hard. We're right now trying to consolidate our base with the Palestinians, and that's going very slowly for reasons I can talk about afterwards. But that, I think, is the challenge of the moment, and that is to go beyond resistance. Resistance is important, but resistance to what end? That's the point. And if you don't have a political end game that you're trying to advocate for, you're powerless. You're floundering. And that is I think that's where we are today, and that's something we have to address.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Actually, you covered many ideas that I had in my notes and discussion, but I would try to start with one point, and I will ask you to elaborate on, please, because I think it's very important in your book. So as you said, that your book provides a vision, a political project, an end game for all this Palestinian sumud and resistance, and a way to summon the power to aim to reach what you called shared community. In fact, while I was reading your book, I felt that by presenting decolonization as unsettling, reframing, and transforming project, and I would like you to elaborate on those elements of decolonization, which aims for justice, equality, and ethical coexistence. It reminded me also of Edward Said, the project of humanism, where he called for establishing a sense of community that is based on civilized coexistence, and is founded on the values of understanding, acceptance, respect, in order to reach the secular, or use the secular human agency in order to reach what Edward Said named sense of community. I think in your book, you call it shared community. I would like to hear from you on the major fears and concerns on both sides who are involved in this project. And I think that will allow you to talk about the transforming elements of decolonization project.
Well, as I said, there aren't concerns and fears on the Israeli side. There's, I mean, the Palestinian issue is just gone. It's a non-issue in Israel because the Zionist project, the Israel, has gotten so strong with so much control, and has insulated its own population, its own Jewish population, to such a degree that there isn't a conflict anymore. There is no threat anymore. There's no dangers anymore. There's a bunch of terrorists out there, but the army is dealing with them, and they're on the other side of the wall anyway. So Israelis feel a real sense of not only personal safety, but of having moved on. We're moving on to other things, and the Palestinian issue is old hat. And it's hard to convey to people, because abroad, this is the issue. It's hard to convey to people the degree to which the Palestinian issue has become a non-issue in Israel. Haaretz did a survey in this last election of what's on the minds of Israeli voters. What are they going to vote for? And what we're talking about, occupation, the peace process, Palestinian rights, was number 11, way, way down the list of concerns for Israelis. And that's the problem. It isn't so much that they're against any process. It's just that it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter to them anymore. And that really becomes very difficult to deal with. And that's why we're suggesting simply to cut our losses and bypass them. And I'll come back to that in a second. In terms of the Palestinians, it's also very difficult. In my view, I mean, I don't want to represent Palestinians. I rather do these talks always with a Palestinian speaker, but just my view is that for the Palestinians, a one state is not a problem. I mean, the Palestinians have always wanted one state, and that was the PLO got it right originally. It was an anti-colonial movement for one democratic state. So that's not the problem. The problem is, you got the Palestinian communities are fragmented, and each fragment, each piece has a different agenda. There's not one uniting agenda anymore. So that Palestinian citizens of Israel, what we call 48 Palestinians, I mean, their agenda is actually to get into Israeli society. You see this in the elections, whether it's a joint Arab list or Ram, the Islamic party that is joining this right-wing coalition. I mean, and Ram, the Islamic party, would rather have joined Netanyahu, because their agenda is religious. It is not national. So they're more opposed to LGBTQ rights than they care about the occupied territory. So, the Palestinians inside Israel have really drifted further and further and further away from the bigger Palestinian issue, partly because they've been excluded from the peace processes and the dialogues all these years. So that right now, where they're at is trying to get into Israeli society. Now we'll see if the intercommunal fighting of the last month inside Israel between Jews and Arabs will change anything. If they'll really begin to see that this integration idea isn't going to happen, and begin to really think about another alternative. So far, there's no leadership really. And so far, again, the tendency after this whole thing in the political discussions has been to try to integrate into Israel. And they don't want the one state idea, because that would alienate the very people they're trying to integrate into. In the West Bank, of course, there's another problem, and that is you've got the PA on your head, the Palestinian Authority, that's advocating two states because that's good for the Palestinian elites. And so there's no political space in the West Bank to begin to develop a political alternative. They'll simply, whether it's Israel or the PA, they'll come down on you very hard. And the same is true in a sense with Gaza, and Hamas leaves very little political space as well. And Hamas as well is a religious fundamentalist movement that's not very good for the Palestinians, in my view. Last week, Hamas said to Israel, "We'll attack you again if you touch the Al-Aqsa Mosque." Nothing about occupation, nothing about demolitions, nothing about Palestinian rights, nothing about any. Al-Aqsa becomes the issue, you see. So there again, there's another agenda that's diverting Palestinians from their goal of liberation, which has to be the goal. And then you have the refugees that have been excluded all these years that are living in another world, and the diaspora exile where you guys are. You know, that's you know, I think is very active, but again, it's missing a political program to be more active. So that's really where we are, and so the whole idea of trying to form a political movement around a one-state idea is very difficult in each Palestinian community for different reasons, you know. And then there's something else that is very interesting that you have to take into account. There's this whole concept among Palestinians, and I'm lecturing you guys who are Palestinians. There's a whole concept which is of a national leadership, that we the people, we the Palestinian grassroots, wherever we are, we don't have the authority or the mandate to go develop and advocate for a political solution. We have to wait on our national leadership. There's a national leadership, and we have to be kind of subservient to them, and there has to be that, you know, and they're the ones that will lead us. We don't have the authority to stand up and get up and pursue a political agenda on our own, which is very disempowering, because in fact, there is no more national leadership. You know, the PLO has been largely dismantled by Abbas and even by Arafat in the PA. It doesn't function anymore. I mean, I can't imagine people looking at Abbas, they don't see him as a national leader. So there's a concept of a national leadership, a concept of a PLO that should be leading the people, you see, that is missing. But at the same time, the people don't feel that they have the authority to take their fate in their hands and really go with. They can do intifadas, they can resist, yes, but to actually articulate a political program coming from the grassroots, they don't have that right or that privilege. And that, I think, is very debilitating. And hopefully, I don't know, the answer to that is either to resuscitate the PLO, and there is some talk of that, or to try to develop some kind of grassroots strategy. But all those things are why our one-state idea is very appealing to people, but it's still seen as utopian. People still, I think, give Israel too much credit. They say Israel would never allow it. And I don't think the Palestinians themselves understand how weak Israel is actually in the international community. And then you've got all these other issues, so that it's a struggle. And the problem is that if we don't begin to develop a meaningful critical mass of Palestinians that will push a political program forward, we're going to be stuck forever. We're going to be left with resistance and protest and BDSing forever, and that's terrible.
Yeah. Can I go back to one point you mentioned in your presentation, and you repeated in your answer about how to deal with the Israeli society? And you mentioned in the book that they won't give up their privileges as settlers, right? And you argued for bypassing, and you said in the book that they should be written off and that decolonization should be imposed on Israeli society
at a certain stage. Yes,
at a certain stage, definitely at the beginning, and in the process and the journey of trying to build this shared community. What about reactions, resistance from this society? And we know that this society is, as you mentioned many times, Israel is great in gaining the support from those governments. I mean, not the people, but the governments. So can we talk about the potential resistance from the Israelis, and how can this project of decolonization and moving towards building one democratic state for Palestinian and Israeli, how can they deal with such resistance or potential resistance?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, especially because Israel is so strong militarily and is willing to use its military might with impunity, as we saw in the last months.
Mhm.
In some ways, it's not so different from Algeria and South Africa. Let me just tell you a little story about Algeria. You had the FLN, the National Liberation Front, in Algeria. Now, this is in the Cold War period. This is the late 1950s.
Yeah.
You got Eisenhower, you got John Foster Dulles, who was the world's super anti-communist in the height of the Cold War. Here you have in Algeria a Muslim terrorist liberation movement. I mean, each of those words was horrifying for Americans, in a liberation war, and Americans were super afraid of liberation wars all over the world against France. So but the FLN sent its best people abroad. The PLO hasn't done that. The Palestine Authority has not sent its best people, unfortunately, to be its representatives abroad. They sent their best people abroad. They worked with governments. They worked with civil society, with churches, trade unions. I mean, and in the 1959, 1960 with Kennedy, it's still the height of the Cold War. The FLN succeeded in getting the United States government and the Soviet Union together, and Red China, the three of them together, to censure in the UN France, a NATO ally, because it was using its weapons against the FLN liberation fighters. Whoa! I mean that's an amazing story. And then the ANC did something kind of similar, because the governments were against the ANC as well. Thatcher and Reagan called them terrorists and everything else. You go to, and I think what those struggles showed is the strength of civil society when it's organized and when it's focused. And I'm talking about trade unions and churches and political groups and university groups. And I mean, we're all involved, those of us of a certain age, in the anti-apartheid struggle, And so, and then, there was pressure on corporations. That was important. No corporation wanted to be associated with the South African regime. Ford pulled out of South Africa, and then you had the sports boycott. And then South Africa was thrown out of the UN. I mean, Israel is violating the UN Charter. It's violating the very terms on which it was accepted into the UN. So but you see, the Palestinians, I have to say, have never, ever really pursued these lines of attack. They've always looked, I don't know, I won't get into all of that. But, until today, certainly the Palestinian Authority doesn't. There's a whole huge struggle that's waiting to be carried on, that everybody's primed for, that just needs that political program. It needs that group that'll come in and say, this is where we're going, and take on some leadership. And then I think we could replicate what the ANC did. I don't think this is utopian, and I don't even think it's that long range. So Israel is very strong, it's true, among governments. And my book, War Against the People, talks about why that's so, because of its military and security and policing exports and all that stuff. But it is not strong among the people. And we saw that over the last month. Israel has lost it in the court of public opinion. And that's why it's so shrill. That's why it's using anti-Semitism and it's so concerned about BDS and all this stuff, because it's in a corner. The Israeli ambassador to the US, the last Israeli ambassador, Ron Dermer, who was the ambassador during the Trump era, said last week, Israel has lost American Jews. All we have left are the evangelicals. So I think one problem of the Palestinians is they're not reading the political map right. They see Israel as so strong and so powerful, which you can understand. I mean, they're living under the boot of the Israelis, but they don't understand, and that's something that you guys should be doing. They don't understand the amount of support that they have in the international community and how they could leverage that support into massive political campaigning that would be very effective if they would have, a concentrated campaigns. If they would lead that, you need Palestinian leadership. Your group can't liberate Palestine from Waterloo. The US campaign's not going to liberate Palestine from Washington. That piece is missing. And so I think if that was in place, all this stuff, that the Israelis, I think Israel would lose. And I think we could, and especially if we have a political program like we do, that is not anti-Israel. It's not saying, it's not against Israel. It's inclusive. It's saying, what it's saying, and this is a great way to frame it. Israel, you created one state here. There already is one state. There already is one state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. There's one functioning government. Don't tell me the Palestinian Authority is a real government. There's one army. There's one economy. There's one infrastructure. There's one set of borders controlled by Israel that everybody has to go through to get into the country. There's one legal system. It's one state by any measure. Okay. So we already have one state. We can put that aside. That argument is over. The question is transforming that apartheid state, and everybody knows it's an apartheid state. Now, Human Rights Watch came out and called it apartheid, so we're beyond apartheid as a real issue of controversy. Even we can start from there. Let's transform the one apartheid state that Israel created. We can't blame the Arabs for this. Israel created into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens. I mean, who in the world could stand up against that if that was really the Palestinians' voice? And if there was a 10-point program like we have that would show everybody how this would work, the economy and the government and the civil society and religion and all this kind of stuff. It's all in place, it's all there, but it has to be put together. And then, once we've done what the ANC did, cause the apartheid regime to collapse and get into a transition into the new democratic state, then the Israelis will join in, I think. Not happily, but that's what happened in South Africa. In South Africa, everybody predicted a bloodbath when apartheid ended. And instead, there was a very peaceful transition. It didn't always work out greatly, especially in the economic front for different reasons, but nevertheless, there was a transition and there was no bloodbath. And I think the same is true here. I think we already have a certain degree of coexistence here. We already know each other to some degree. And I think that if this regime would collapse and Israelis have no choice, I think they would participate in a transition to something new. So, the South African, I think, example with its differences really is very instructive in terms of where we could be going. And again, my frustration, I guess, maybe you hear it in my voice, is that it's all there and it's all so clear. And yet we can't somehow politically get our act together. And that's, I think, our problem.
Yeah. Reading the plan, the strategy for the one democratic state, the transformation from the de facto one state that established by Israel to this democratic state. I have a question related to the nature of this democracy, because in your book, you mentioned that international humanitarian law, human rights discourse are tools of these big powers, global hegemons that represent certain liberal forms of governmentality. So let me hear from you about how can we save the dream of this democratic state from those traps of liberal governmentality. So this is way in the journey. I would love to hear from you about that.
Well, one thing one project, and this we could do if we got grouped together. What the ANC did You see, what helped the ANC in terms of this transition, to get a white buy-in into dismantling apartheid, was in 1955 they came out with a freedom charter that said our vision of the new South Africa is inclusive. We're all South Africans, right? Now that didn't persuade the whites, of course, but when transition did come, that was very important. They were able to do the transition to whites because they saw that they were a part of the new system. It wasn't against them. And in fact, the ANC had a new constitution for South Africa that was written before the end of apartheid. So people could really see how this would work. When the day de Klerk left office, there was already a new structure in place that could just be brought in with a new constitution that people agreed upon. We could begin already, and this might be, something to move our project forward. We could already begin to formulate a new constitution, so people would really see how this works. We could get together some, there's some Palestinian legal experts. There's some, George Bisharat out in California, for example. There's a lot of Palestinian lawyers. Plus, there's some Israeli lawyers that would participate, human rights people. Plus people like Richard Falk and John Dugan and Dugart and others. You could easily get a top-rate commission of legal scholars and human rights people. Nora Erakat could be a part of that, to sit down and begin to translate the vision and then the 10-point program into an actual constitution, because that would really give people the idea that, hey, this is really workable. And this is something that we could live with. And I think even Israelis, I think it would begin to bring in more and more Israelis as well. And when finally transition comes, we're ready for that. So those are, I don't know if that addresses your question, but that's sort of the way I see.
It does, because it's a work in progress at the end. But these things, you addressed it in your book, but I think it's always good to remember it. And you actually talked about how this project bring this, the idea of protecting individual rights. And in the book, you talked a lot about the collective rights and this relationship between the decolonization and the reconstruction of identity for both national communities. And actually, I was interested in asking you about this particular point, how these two national communities can protect their identity, because identity is something that you need to protect within such polity. But at the same time, we are trying to avoid binational entity here. So maybe you can elaborate on this point, because I think it's very important.
No, it is very important. We did not go the binational route. The idea that, binational state, for two reasons. First of all, that was too much for the Palestinians. The Palestinians know that there's Israelis here. And they know Israelis are a national group. That's not the problem. They know they're going to live with Israelis. They might not be happy about it, but everybody's bit that bullet, and they know that.
Mm-hmm.
But calling it a binational state forces the Palestinians to accept the legitimacy of settler colonialism, of Zionism. It forces them to recognize an Israeli nationality, you see, that legitimizes somehow this claim to the country. And that, of course, they're unwilling to do. So they're willing to say, look, we'll live with Israelis, and Israelis can be anything they want to be. That's their issue. They can have their collective identity within our democratic state. That's their issue. But this state is not going to be a state that validates Zionism. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, again, binationalism perpetuates the borders between the peoples. Our whole idea is to create a situation where a new civil society and a new political community comes into being, a new us. So if you want to live in your own community, you're a religious Muslim. you're a refugee coming back. And we know the refugees coming back want to come back as Palestinians. They're not ready for some civil society that's, you know, they want to come back to their land and their heritage. They need a generation or two as Palestinians, and that's fine. You know, if you're an Orthodox Jew and you want to live in your own community, you know, whoever you are, you can do that. You're an African asylum seeker. We have to realize that there are only Jews and Palestinians here. There are 40,000 African asylum seekers here. There's a couple 100,000 Russians here who are not Jewish that are here as well. There's other communities. You can have all of that. That's fine. But at the same time, what we would like, our whole idea is that at some point, a critical mass of inhabitants of this country begin to come together and live together. And we begin to see ourselves over time as us. And I think with a young generation, that would happen fairly quickly. You know, I was in South Africa a few years ago, and I talked to the old anti-apartheid activists. You know, they have an educational project to teach the young generation in South Africa, the Black kids in South Africa, about apartheid. The young people have never heard of Soweto. They never heard of Passport. They don't know anything. That's like ancient history. So that the good news is that the conflict that we're living in, you know, could become ancient history for young people, you know, within a half a generation, probably. You see, so as we start living together, if we don't have those boundaries of national lines all the time, but that we see ourselves as one country, then you'd make your own decision how much you want to be within your own communal framework with your own identity, how much you want to be a part of the larger society, you know, how much of your identity you want to keep, or how much, you know, you want to, you know, it's fluid like that, which is the way it is in Canada, basically, which is the way it is in most democratic, pluralistic societies. So that's, I think that's, so that's the, you know, for those two reasons, we didn't go the binational route. At the same time, we realize, like I said, that there are national identities here. There are Palestinian Arabs, and the national identity is important to them, and there are Israeli Jews. So that this idea of recognizing collective identity, allowing groups to have their museums, can have their languages. Nobody's going to end the Hebrew language. You know, you have a dual language in Canada. You know, to allow the groups to have to see this from the very beginning as a pluralistic society of national groups and ethnic groups and religious groups and other kinds of groups. But a democracy can incorporate that. That doesn't mean that we can't be equal citizens participating in a broader society. And over time, a certain sense of us will emerge, I think.
I have long list of points that I would like to hear more from you, but I know that we are allowing 30 minutes for our audience to ask their questions through the chat or the Q&A, but I would like to hear from you more on the refugee point, because we all know that Palestinian refugees, they have an international internationally recognized right of return, but it's frozen and denied by the Israeli state at the moment. But in your book, I found it really fascinating that you are linking the return of refugees with a full program of integration. Exactly. Which offers refugees the chance to decide and live with dignity rather than move from one place to another that is called home, but still they don't have the tools to establish their new life. So can you elaborate and talk about this program? Because I think it's very important for our audience to hear about this particular point.
Right. Well, the whole refugee issue, again, gets back to the basic logic and the concept of our one-state idea. We're going, you see, Israel is based on an ethno-national religious basis. Who you are in society depends on what your religion is, what your ethnic background is, what your nationality is. So if you're an Israeli Jew, you have certain rights. and privileges and everything else. And if you're a Palestinian Arab, you have a whole different set. That's why it's apartheid. And they're not equal, of course. So our whole concept of one state is to go from that basis, ethno-national, religious, to a state based on citizenship. Because you really don't have that concept in Israel. Now you have it in a certain formal way, but not really. Palestinians aren't really citizens. So the idea of citizenship, where everybody is a citizen of the country. Okay. Now that releases a whole logic. So refugees have the right to return. True. But it's more than a right. They are our citizens. You know, they're citizens of the country. You know, in 1948, when they were driven out, they didn't lose their civil status. You know, when a refugee is forced out of their home or even voluntarily leaves their home, they don't lose their civil status. I can go run off to somewhere else and I don't stop becoming a citizen of my own country. So they're still our citizens. And we want them to come home because the one state is an ingathering of our citizens, of our people. So that it's another layer. It isn't only that they have a right to come back, but they should come back because they are an integral part of our population. They're our citizens, our people who have been forced to be outside of our country and they can come back. So that's really important. Now, again, like you say, you know, the issue isn't only the return. You know, now I don't know how many would return. It could be a few, it could be 1 million, it could be 2 million. I mean, nobody knows. But they should have, everybody that wants to return should have the right to return, of course. But all right, now what? You see, these are people, many of them, not all, but many of them are undereducated, unskilled, traumatized, having lived under years of terrible conditions and violence. You know, we have to understand that to a large degree, this is a traumatized population. So it's not that they're going to come back and all of a sudden start a normal life the next day. So we have to think about how we reintegrate them into society, into the society here. And there's already moves in that direction. For example, Zochrot, you know, has this organization, has a whole group, and if you look up their website, you can see it, ZOCHROT. They have whole groups of young Palestinian planners and architects that have already planned new communities for refugees. Now you're not going to come back to your home. That your home is gone, probably gone. You know, almost all the houses are gone. But you can, but you can come back to the part of the country that you come from. You know, Salman Abu Sita, who's a Palestinian geographer, has done really detailed studies of land, and he found that 85% of the land taken from the Palestinians in 1948 is still available. It's still open. In other words, it's either agricultural land. All right, they demolished the village, but the agricultural land has been incorporated into a kibbutz or a moshav or something, or it's public parks. You see, so the land is still there. So they could come back to the land, you know, at least to the area where they were from, and a new community could either integrate into an existing, but a new communities could be built with modern infrastructure, you know, Palestinian elements maybe, so it's, you know, meaningful architecture, but a modern community, you know, with other people living in it, so they're not living in a ghetto, you know, they're living with other people, and over time they're reintegrated. In other words, this is what we have to do. We have to show how this one state idea can actually work, and we have the data. I mean, it's workable. The land is there. You know, there's open questions we have to talk about. For example, what land regime will we have here? Yeah. Now, here actually Israel has a good land regime. It's not good in the way that it's not open to everyone, but the idea is good, and that is the land of the country belongs to the state. Yeah. And the state allocates land according to need. Now, if everybody has access, if the state is really representing everybody, then that's a very rational way of allocating land. So you're preserving land, it's sustainable, but nevertheless, you're addressing the needs of different populations. So there's a lot of actual nuts and bolts kind of stuff that has to be done, that kind of work that has to be done. But again, I think even the question of the refugees and the reintegration shows how doable this is. Not only how just it is, not only that we have to take it's not a burden to take them, it's a challenge to us to take them back and they, you know, and give them their place and help them integrate. I mean, that's kind of an exciting thing to do. That's part of our nation building. So that if we look at it in that sense, if you look at the one state as a challenge rather than a threat or something weird, but a challenge, how are we going to build a new society? Wow, that's a pretty exciting idea.
Thank you, Jeff, for this. I will now turn to Bob, who will bring the questions from our audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this discussion. There were many questions, not only in Q&A, but in the chat. So I've been trying to curate them a little bit. So first question, for those of us in diaspora, should we be pushing the one democratic state solution, or should we be supporting Palestinians and Israeli peacemakers on the ground to arrive at their own solution, whatever that ends up looking like?
No, of course. I mean, it's a yes. I mean, even there, you know, the authority to do this, the initiative, has to come from the Palestinians, mainly here. I mean, I think all Palestinians should be a part of it because it's a whole community. I mean, Palestinians in Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territory, refugees, and the diaspora all have to be part of it. But it has to be a Palestinian-led kind of a movement onto which critical Israeli Jews like me join in, and then, you know, and because I think we have something critical to offer too, since we're stakeholders in this whole thing, and then it goes to the wider international community to support and mobilize around. I think that's the way it has to be done. But you know, here there's a problem as well that I just want to touch on, and that is that there's a certain retreat from political abroad, and you're beginning to get a discourse even among Palestinians. You see it on the Al-Shabaka website, for example, which is a website of young Palestinian intellectuals, and in other places, where people are starting to say, Palestinians are starting to say, I think because of the lack of a political process and a program, we don't care anymore about the political program. I don't care if it's 1 state, 2 states, 10 states, just give us our human rights. We just want our human rights. Well, you know, and you get that in the BDS discourse as well, quite a bit. Well, human rights, and that's where actually Noura Arakat's book is excellent. Because she makes the point, she's a human rights professor. She makes the point that human rights international are very important. They're important as guidelines and so on, but they're not political programs. They're not a replacement for a political program. Human rights are not a political program. You can't build a state based on, I mean, you have to have human right foundations, but you know, a state is a political project. It's not a human rights project. And so to the degree that the Palestinians, some of them are beginning to replace a political program, a political approach with a human rights approach, I think is very problematic because it brings us back another stage behind some political initiative. So I think that, you know, as if we start thinking politically about all of this, then that's what's going to allow us to integrate human rights, integrate all the campaigns we're doing, integrate BDS and everything else, but into a focused campaign for an end game.
Thank you. Another question is, the US theoretically gave Blacks their rights at the end of the Civil War, but we've had 150 years of Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, redlining, lynchings, economic inequality, police brutality, etc. How will the new Israeli state avoid this?
It won't be an Israeli state. We have to reimagine now. We have to reimagine everything. Sometimes Palestinians say to me, what about the wall? No, there's no wall. What about settlements? No, there's no settlement. You know, we have to reimagine what one democratic state means. That the land is owned collectively, that people live wherever they want to, that, you know, it functions as a normal integrated society, in which Jim Crow laws and religious-based laws and that, like we have today in Israel, are gone. You don't have any more sides, or we're all in one parliament. We all have common citizenship, and so on. And so I think it's not that there's not we won't have to keep fighting racism. I think one good thing about our situation is that the settler colonial project of Zionism was not based on racism. And it wasn't, in other words, you didn't have a black-white issue. There's no race biological issue. It's an issue of nationalism. There's issues of religion here, which sometimes are even harder than racial. But it isn't a racial thing. So there isn't, I think, the same Jim Crow kind of a potential here that you had in the States. We have to overcome other obstacles, but I think the idea of, I don't think that there's a racial element to what's happening here. And so that's positive thing. And with a strong constitution and I think both peoples are strong, we should be able to I'm not going to achieve the ideal society, but a good, fairly egalitarian society here. The other, just one more point, and that is we have to understand too, that the Palestinians are starting from a strong point. Not like the blacks in South Africa, in the US that were slaves coming out of slavery, and then, tenant type sharecropping systems, or South Africa where they lived under apartheid. But 90-some% of Palestinians are literate. They have a very high educational standard. You've got 5 universities in the occupied territory, and plus the Palestinians here in Israel that have higher educations, and abroad. In the Palestinian community abroad, the exile is highly educated and very rich, especially in South America, so that the Palestinians have their own resources. And they also have, just like Israel had resources of Jews abroad and investing, the Palestinians would have the investment of Palestinians living abroad in this one state, I believe. So they're actually, I think, a parity between Israeli Jews and Palestinians is possible within a fairly short, probably within a generation, maybe. So it isn't at all like the black-white situation, I think, in the United States. That's a completely different universe.
Thank you. Another question. In the new democratic state you envisage, how would you see the transformation of illegal Zionist settlements will take place to achieve full justice for the Palestinians? Shouldn't they be returned to Palestinian ownership?
Well, the settlements, for the most part, aren't built on previous Palestinian places. It's not Sheikh Jarrah writ large. These are settlements that were built on agricultural lands or grazing lands, pretty much on the on the West Bank. So there is an issue of ownership. I mean, the lands were sometimes owned by people, but it isn't a matter of people having lost their houses for the settlements. So that, again, I think that if we begin to get, we have to decide on a countrywide land regime, who the land belongs to. Will land go back to its private owners, or will the land be nationalized, like most of the land is anyway today? And people get compensated, but then they have, I don't know. We're gonna have to find a private-public balance here somewhere based on land ownership. And then you can have compensation. And I think, people have different views of the settlements in our group as well. We don't have one unified view yet, but I think a lot of people say the settlements aren't the problem. Settlement is a problem because it's all Jewish and it's put in a very strategic place for control. But once Ma'ale Adumim, for example, is integrated, in other words, it's good housing. I mean, the houses aren't the good housing, there's infrastructure. Let's use that resource. Once it's integrated, it loses its controlling aspect. So, it's not the houses that are bad, it's the way they're used politically. So I think in our concept, if instead of dismantling the settlements, we try to find the owners of the land to agree that it's built on some private land, compensate them in just ways, but simply integrate the settlements, and they become normal communities within our country, just like the Jewish neighborhoods inside Israel become integrated. And I think that's really the way to go. Rather than the idea of dismantling and even returning, I think I prefer to think of it as a transformation in which we're getting into something new. We have to compensate and really address what happened in the past and compensate people and so on. But at the same time, we have to sort of take, you're not going to erase what Israel's done in the last 70 some years. You have to take the infrastructure, take what we have and build upon it in a way that's egalitarian and accessible and just for all the people living here.
Thank you. Next question. Can you speak a little to how a single state would exist in terms of military and police forces to ensure that there are not pogrom-style massacres in individual towns and cities?
Okay. First of all, let me say, again, reimagining that. I think what we're assuming is that our one state project, by addressing all the underlying grievances and the injustices and creating a new system of equality and inclusiveness, addresses and resolves the old conflicts. But there's no more reason, there's no rationale for a pogrom. If you create a win-win situation where this is good for everybody, it's good economically, it's good politically, it's good culturally, it's good in every sense. It addresses the needs of everybody living here. People feel a sense of belonging. They feel that yes, this is a fairly just place to live and so on. Why would there be pogroms? I mean, we're sort of assuming that somehow biologically or primordially we're enemies with each other. That's not the case. We lived a shared life in this country for millennia before Zionism. So in a sense, what we're talking about, living together again as a shared community, it's happened before. It isn't something new. And if you're addressing the conflicts in a real way, then there's no reason to have them anymore. So I think then, the military, if there is a military, and the police become normalized. They become integrated. You have normal police functions. You have normal military functions. And you don't have any more, Jewish communities and Palestinian communities. There's much more integration, in the country. So, again, we have to sort of reimagine it in that sense. And I think what the one line that we're offering is a win-win political settlement for everyone. And that releases a whole new dynamic in which it's counterproductive. It doesn't make sense to go back and start fighting with each other.
Thank you. Another question, and I think we have time for one, possibly two more. As a Palestinian living in Canada, I feel a huge resistance on behalf of the government in acknowledging my rights and my existence. What plan of action exists at the current political level that I could use as a platform to create a shift in the direction of a just and humane society for Palestinians?
That's where you need the political program. That's where I go back to the end game, because I mean, everybody agrees. I think even Justin Trudeau agrees that there should be some justice for Palestinians. I mean, they talk about a Palestinian state because that's the easiest way to do conflict management. You talk about a two-state solution that is not going to happen, but it keeps the whole thing going on indefinitely. So, we have to understand that. But I think, the only way to translate what everybody really understands, I think even a lot of the people that are holding on to the two-state idea are doing so because they don't see an alternative. We haven't offered an alternative. So you're not going to jump into the into the darkness with the whole Palestinian people. You've got to go. You have to help them make a transition to something. From if you ask him to go, it's a paradigm shift. You're asking him to go from here to here, but we haven't defined the new here. So what do we expect people to do? So you have this situation where I think in the international civil society around the world, and in many governments, among parliamentarians, you have tremendous support for Palestinians and understanding of the Palestinian cause and struggle and support. But what do we do with that? How do we translate that into something political, you see? And if you don't have a political plan, you're stuck. And that's where we are. The problem isn't that, I don't think, is with governments. I think governments can change their policies just like they did in South Africa. We can cause them with pressure to change their policies to accept a one-state solution. We could do that. Well, you have to have the one-state solution in place, detailed as a good political program in order to do that. And if you're missing that ingredient, then again, you're stuck. You're just left with good feelings and resistance and campaigns and things that are unfocused and not effective. So that's the missing element, I think.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe the international community will bring enough pressure on Israel to change into an egalitarian state without the US joining in, or do you believe the US will also pressure Israel?
I think the US could be brought in as well. You see it now. You see, especially in the Democratic Party. I mean, I'm not expecting a lot of Republicans, but within the Democratic Party, especially the young generation, you see this shift very strongly. As a matter of fact, people don't remember, back in 2008, I think, Obama was running for president. And they had the Democratic National Convention in, I think, Charlotte, North Carolina, if I'm not mistaken. And they were voting on the platform, getting the whole Democratic platform in place. And they forgot Jerusalem. All of a sudden, AIPAC and some of the Democratic people said, hey, wait, we forgot a plank on Jerusalem, our American support for Jerusalem. And you can look this up on the internet if you don't believe me. So the mayor of Los Angeles, whatever his name was then, is the chair. He said, we're going to have a vote. Jerusalem is an inseparable part of the state of Israel, something, whatever that wording was. Okay. They had a vote, yay, nay, and it was nayed down. The Democratic Convention, with no preparation, no lobbying, voted down the plank of saying Jerusalem is a part of Israel. Whoa, so what happened? They panicked. They said, well, it wasn't clear. Let's have a second vote. And they had a second vote and the nays again carried it. So they said, well, it still wasn't clear. Let's have another vote. And there was a third vote. And in the third vote, the same thing happened. And the chairman said, passed. and the plank went into the Democratic platform. So even 12 years ago, they couldn't get through the Democratic Party democratically the idea that Jerusalem is a part of Israel. So people get it. People get it. They understand what's happening. But again, they're lacking that. What do I do with it? Where do I go with all of that? And that's what we have. That's what we have to give them. And I think if we do, I think pressures on the American administration. It might not be immediate, but the U.S. itself is finding itself isolated internationally on the Palestine issue. Look at the last Security Council thing on Gaza. They had to have 3 or 4 vetoes against everybody else, to let Israel continue to attack Gaza. So the United States is paying a price for this. And I think you could create a coalition of forces, both governmental around the world and also civil society, even within the US, that in the end would put such pressure on the US. And actually the Democrats know, I mean, it's not, it's something they know, they just haven't acted on. I think you could do that. And again, if the American Jewish community supports that kind of idea that I think they're moving towards, the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is the largest growing American Jewish organization of young people, is officially an anti-Zionist organization. They have an anti-Zionist proclamation on their site. So this isn't just Pollyannish stuff. This is really happening, and I really do believe, again, it's like a mantra. If we get this political program in place, that you're going to see tremendous movement politically, and I think you can get governments to begin to move towards a one-state idea, because it's the only way out.
Thank you. This is a follow-up to your comments about attaining a one-state solution. How does this roll out? There is no reason for white police officers and residents to kill African Americans, but no reason seems necessary to terrorist whites. How do you preclude this happening in Israel? There must be a transition. How does that happen?
Look, I think that, we haven't gotten to the point. I mean, first of all, there are reasons why they attack African Americans. There's economic reasons, there's racism, there's all kinds of things going into that. It isn't always just, for no reason at all. And that's missing here. That's the good news. In other words, you don't have, I'm going to say this, and you could agree with me or not agree with me. We don't have the level of hatred between the groups that you have in other places. The hatred towards the blacks, the African Americans in the US, the hatred between, let's say, the Irish and the English, the hatred between the Poles and the Russians, or the Poles and the Germans, the hatred you had between the French and the Germans. I mean, those were real. I mean, there's a real basis for that. There was a hatred there that to a large degree has dissipated, as the EU has developed and all of that. But you don't have that here. You have, I think the Palestinians are outraged. They're pissed off. They know that they're not terrorists, that Israel is using them as foils, is instrumentalizing them. It's, they know all that stuff, but it hasn't gotten to a point of hatred. And also from the Israeli point of view, we might disregard Palestinians, but I don't think there's a hatred of Palestinians. Even among settlers, I don't think so. That hatred element is missing that you have, I think, in the US, between communities. And I think Netanyahu is trying to incite hatred. I think that was behind the attacks on Al-Aqsa, on Ramadan. He knows that the way to hatred for him is good, because if he can develop a religious hatred, that's the only basis that this hatred is going to develop, is religiously. Then he knows that he's created conditions in which there can never be negotiations. And we can perpetuate the occupation forever because we can always blame the Palestinians for the violence. So that's a danger we have to look out for. But until today, I would say the good news is that there has to be reconciliation. There has to be Israeli acknowledgement of what happened, certainly. But we don't have that level of intercommunal hatred like you had in Northern Ireland, for example, or in South Africa, that would create these sorts of tensions. I think we're starting from a much healthier place, even with the history of the last 70 years.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments and these answers. I'll turn the time now over to Mesa.
I will briefly just summarize this amazing and inspiring presentation and discussion. I think we were really privileged to have you here, Jeff, to talk about this vision. And I know it's always challenging, like going through the questions. And I know we didn't have time to ask all the questions, even my own questions. I had a long list that I didn't have the chance to.
We can always do it again.
Yes, let's do it again. I think we need to do this more often, because we are not talking about an easy project here. We are talking about transformation. We are talking about vision. We are talking about something that is challenging for both sides. And we are talking about fighting at different levels. And let me here just end my note by talking about something I really fascinate when you, in your work, when you bring that notion of global Palestine in in the face of Israel as a server for global hegemons. And I think this way of kind of like articulating the struggle and the need and the importance of decolonization, I think give the great kind of like vision about how much it's needed. It's not only for Palestinians, it's not only for the Israelis, it's for everybody, it's for all grassroots movements all over the world. It's a struggle for everyone who's interested in fighting this neo-liberal hegemons all over the globe. So we would love to hear more from you on this global struggle for liberating Palestine through decolonization of Israel. And I think we need to read the book. We need more books actually from you on this plan, because from the interest and from the questions, I think people really need to know more about the details of this project, and we need to work more, all of us, on educating ourselves about the importance, about the details, about the steps, and the whole chapters of the journey. So thank you, Jeff, and I ask our audience to, thank you very much. And I ask our audience to watch our Facebook page for news of our next webinar. And we would love to have you here in person, Jeff, hopefully when the restrictions are over. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye all.
Bye.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much for having me.
Thank you.